1. Philosophy today, the strange adventure which befalls truths, the coming of the truth, articulation of history with philosophy. In matters of art, love, or ideas, I think that programs and announcements are of little use. So far as ideas are concerned, meditation on any theme, if positive and honest, inevitably separates him who does the meditating from the opinion prevailing around him, from that which, for reasons more serious than you might now suppose, can be called public or popular opinion. Every intellectual effort sets us apart from the commonplace and leads us by hidden and difficult paths to secluded spots where we find ourselves amid unaccustomed thoughts. These are the results of our meditation. Now the announcement or program anticipates these results, smooths the path ahead, and discloses the end at which they are to be discovered. But, as we shall see, a thought that is separated from the mental road that leads toward it, a thought standing alone and abrupt as an island, is an abstraction in the worst sense of the word, and, by the same token, is unintelligible. What is to be gained when one begins an investigation by showing the public what he hopes to find at the top of the steep road? Why start a philosophic inquiry at the end? So I refuse to put the substance of these lectures into the capital letters of a printed program. I propose to begin at the beginning with what may be for you today, as it was for me yesterday, the starting point. We begin with a well-known fact, namely, the very different public position in which philosophy finds itself in the collective spirit today if compared with the place it occupied in the early part of this century, and by the same token, the different attitude which the philosopher takes toward his own work and his own profession. The first, like every public and external fact, can be demonstrated by means which are also external. For example, by comparing statistically the number of books on philosophy that the public consumes today with the number it absorbed 30 years ago. It is common knowledge that today, in almost every country, more books on philosophic subjects are sold than on literary subjects, and that a growing curiosity concerning the science of ideas can be found wherever one chooses to look. This curiosity, this eagerness that makes itself felt at very different levels of conscious clarity, is composed of two ingredients. The public is beginning to feel a new need for ideas, and at the same time to feel in ideas a certain voluptuous pleasure. The combination of these two characteristics is not accidental. We will see later how every essential need which springs from within, rather than coming by chance from without, is accompanied by a certain pleasurable reaction of the senses. Voluptuous delight is the face that happiness wears, and every living creature is happy when he fulfills his destiny, that is, when he realizes himself, when he is being that which in truth he is. For this reason, Scheling, inverting the relationship between pleasure and destiny, said, "We have a genius for what we like." Genius, man's superlative gift for doing something, always carries a look of supreme pleasure. Later, and with ample evidence, we will find ourselves surprised to discover what may now seem only a phrase, that each one's destiny is in turn his greatest delight. Compared with the times that preceded it, our era apparently has a philosophic destiny. Therefore, one takes pleasure in philosophizing, in pricking up one's ears as philosophic phrases roll through the public air, or in flocking to the philosopher as to a traveller thought to bring news direct from the other world. Contrast such a situation with that which ruled a generation or so ago, and in surprising correspondence with that change in the public spirit, we find that today's philosopher faces philosophy in a state of mind which is completely the opposite of that which his colleagues of the earlier generation found productive. So we are going to talk first of why it is that we approach philosophy in a frame of mind so different from that which ruled among yesterday's thinkers. Starting at this point, we will move steadily ahead toward a goal which I will not now spell out because it would not yet be understood, We will go moving toward it in concentric circles, their radius growing shorter and developing a greater degree of tension each time we swing around, slipping along from the outside of the spiral, cold, abstract, and indifferent, toward a center which is frighteningly intimate, even pathetic in itself, although not in our way of handling it. The great philosophic problems demand a tactic like that which the Hebrews used for the taking of Jericho and its innermost rose gardens, making no direct attack, circling slowly around them, tightening the curve every time, and holding live in the air the dramatic sound of trumpets. In an ideological siege, it is the dramatic melody which keeps alert the consciousness of those problems that form the drama of ideas. I hope this tension will not slacken, for the road we are now starting is of such nature that it gains in attraction as we go forward. From the external and the abstruse, which we have just mentioned, we drop to more immediate matters. The most immediate matters in that they concern our very lives, the lives of each and every one of us. We are going to descend boldly below what each one customarily thinks his life to be, and which really is merely its crust. Piercing this crust, we will enter into subterranean zones of our own living, zones which hold for us the most intimate secrets of being, secrets of our deepest selves, of the pure being, of our being. But the fact of saying this is, I repeat, by no means an announcement. On the contrary, it is a safeguard and a precaution which I am obliged to take in view of the unexpected abundance of listeners whom our generous and restless city, far more restless than one might think, and restless in a much more essential sense, has sent me. Under the title, What is Philosophy?, I announced an academic course, therefore a strictly scientific course. I do not know whether a misinterpretation of that title made many believe that I was proposing to give an elementary introduction to philosophy, that is, to treat the complex and traditional philosophic question in a superficial and simplified fashion. I must clear away any such error. It could only distract and defraud your attention. What I want to do is the exact opposite of an introduction to philosophy. It is to take the philosophic activity itself, philosophizing itself, and submit it to basic analysis. So far as I know, this, strange as it may seem, has never been done. Certainly it has not been done with the degree of resolution which we are now going to apply to it. Far from being one of these themes that is considered proper for public interest, this is a matter which, in the beginning at least, seems to be of the most technical and professional interest, suitable only for philosophers. If, as we deal with it, we stumble on themes that seem more human, if, in the rigorous search for what philosophy may be, we happen suddenly to fall through a trap-door into the most human of the human, into the warm and palpitating heart of life itself, and there find ourselves pursuing problems of the street, and even of the bedchamber. This will be because it has to be that way, because the technical development of my technical problem demands it, and not because I advertise problems, hunt for them, or think them out in advance. The only thing I announce is the exact opposite, a monographic study on a hyper-technical question. Therefore I remain free and at liberty not to renounce any one of the intellectual difficulties imposed by such a proposal. At the same time, I must make the most royal effort so that what I say will be clear to all of you, even to those who have had no previous training. I have always thought that clarity is the form of courtesy that the philosopher owes. Moreover, this discipline of ours considers it more truly a matter of honor today than ever before to be open to all minds and porous for their probing. This is different from the individual sciences, which increasingly impose between the treasure of their discoveries and the curiosity of the profane, the tremendous dragon of their closed terminology. I think that the philosopher must, for his own purposes, carry methodical strictness to an extreme when he is investigating and pursuing his truths. But when he is ready to enunciate them and to give them out, he ought to avoid the cynical skill with which some scientists, like a Hercules at the fair, amuse themselves by displaying to the public the biceps of their technique. So I say that for us today, philosophy is a very different thing from what it was for the last generation. But to say this is to recognize that truth changes, that yesterday's truth is today's error, and that by the same token today's truth will not be serviceable tomorrow. Does this not rob our own truth of prestige? Skepticism's most popular argument, and certainly a rough one, was Agrippa's figure of speech called ton apo tes diaphonias ten doson, concerning the lack of consonance among dogmas, the variety and change of opinions about truth, the devotion to doctrines not only different but apparently in contradiction, is such as to invite incredulity. Therefore, let us at this point go forth to meet this popular skepticism. More than once you will have pondered on the strange adventure which befalls truths. Take, for example, the law of universal gravitation. In the measure in which this law is true, there is no doubt that it has always been true, that ever since bodies, ponderable matter, existed, they have always behaved according to its formulation. Nevertheless, this law had to wait until a sunny day in the 17th century when it was discovered by a man in one of the British Isles. And it is not impossible that on another sunny day men may forget this law, not refute it or correct it, because we are assuming its character to be that of complete truth, but simply forget it, and in that respect return to the same state of failing to suspect it that they were in before Newton discovered it. This frailty gives truths a double condition, which is exceedingly curious. In themselves they exist forever, without alteration or modification, yet their acquisition by a real person, subject to time, gives them an aspect that is historical. They surge forth on one date, and they may disappear on another. Clearly, this temporal quality does not affect them, but it does affect their presence in the human mind. What really happens in time is the psychic act with which we think about them. This is a real event, an effective change in the flow of moments. It is the fact of our knowing these truths, or being ignorant of them, which has a history. And it is this which is mysterious and disquieting, for it means that by virtue of one of our thoughts, a transitory and fugitive reality, in a most fugitive world, we enter into possession of something that is permanent and supertemporal. Thought, then, is a point where two worlds, antagonistic in composition, come together. Our thoughts are born and die, pass, return, succumb. Meanwhile, their content, that which is thought, remains invariable. 2 and 2 continue to be 4 when the intellectual act with which we understand this truth has ceased to be. But even to say this, to say that truths are always truths, is inadequate. To exist forever, sempiternal existence, means the persistence of something throughout the length of the time series, an unlimited duration which is no less duration than it is that of the mayfly. Enduring is being submerged in the torrent of time, more or less vulnerable to its influence. Well then, truths do not last for much or for little time. They do not possess any temporal attribute. They do not bathe in the river of time at all. Leibniz called them vérité éternelle, in my judgment improperly. Later we will see for what basic reasons. If the sempiternal lasts as long as the totality of time itself, the eternal exists before time begins and after it ends, but it includes within itself all of time. It is duration raised to hyperbole, a superduration. So much is this so, that in it duration is conserved at the same time as it is annulled. An eternal being lives an infinite time, that is, it lasts for a single instant, that is to say, it does not last. It possesses, complete and integral, in a manner both simultaneous and complete, a life without end. This, in fact, is the delicate definition of eternity which Boethius gives. Interminabilis vitae tota simul et perfecta possessio. But the relation of truths to time is not positive, but negative. It is simply not having to deal with time in any sense. It is being completely apart from all temporal qualification. It is maintaining oneself entirely outside of time. To say, then, that truths are always true does not, strictly speaking, involve less impropriety than if we say, to use a famous example which Leibniz brought to another proposition, green justice. The ideal body of justice offers no sign nor orifice, where the attribute greenness can be hooked onto it, and however many times we try to insert it, we see it slide over justice as over a polished surface. Our attempt to put both concepts together fails, and even though we speak of them in the same breath, they stay stubbornly apart without any possible adherence of the one to the other. There is no greater degree of heterogeneity than that which exists between the atemporal mode of being, which is characteristic of truths, and the temporal manner of being that is native to the human being, who discovers truths and thinks them, knows them, or ignores them, repeats them, or forgets them. If, however, we use that phrase, truths are always true, it is because, speaking practically, this carries no erroneous consequences. It is an error, but innocent and convenient. Thanks to it, we look at that strange manner of being which truths enjoy in the same time-conscious way with which we customarily look at things in our world. In the last analysis, to say of something that it is always what it is equivalent to affirming its independence of temporal variations, its lack of vulnerability. Within the temporal sphere, this is the characteristic which is closest to the pure non-temporal. It is a quasi-form of the non-temporal, the species quaedam aeternitatis. Hence Plato, seeing that it was necessary to place truths, which he called ideas, outside the temporal world, invented another extra-mundane quasi-place, the eupenuranos topos, the supercelestial region. Although this had serious consequences in Plato's thinking, let us recognize that, as an image, it was fertile. It allows us to represent our temporal world to ourselves as a sphere surrounded by another circumference having a different ontological atmosphere, where live the non-temporal truths indifferent to time. But note that at a certain instant, one of those truths, the law of gravitation, filtered down from that other world into our own, as if taking advantage of a crevice which widened and let it pass. Like a meteorite, the idea is projected into the world of humans and of history, an image of the coming, the descent which throbs in the depth of all religions that acknowledge the existence of a God. But that fall, that filtering of a trans-mundane truth into our world, poses an extremely precise and suggestive question, which, and this is shameful, still remains to be investigated. The crevice which opened and gave the truth a chance to slip through is no other than the mind of a man. Well now, why is such a truth apprehended? Why is it captured on such and such a day by such and such a man, if, like its sister truths, it has pre-existed indifferent to time? Why was it not thought of before or afterwards? Why was its discoverer not someone else? Apparently this is a matter of an essential affinity between the figure of that truth and the form of the crevice, the human subject through which it passes. Nothing happens without reason. If what happened was that the law of gravitation was not discovered until Newton came along, it is evident that some affinity must have existed between the human individual, Newton, and that law. What kind of an affinity is this? Is it a likeness? We are not trying to make the question easy, but on the contrary to emphasize its enigmatic force. How can a man resemble a truth, a geometric truth, for example, or any other, in any way? In what does the man Pythagoras resemble the theorem of Pythagoras? The schoolboy, joking, will say that the theorem resembled his breeches, thus showing an unconscious inclination to pair the theorem with the person of its author. The difficulty is that Pythagoras did not wear breeches. In his day they were worn only by the Scythians, who, on the other hand, did not discover theorems. Here, for the first time, we stumble on a basic distinction which differentiates our philosophy from that which has held the stage for centuries. This distinction consists in taking account of something that is very elemental, namely, that there is no direct resemblance between the person who thinks, sees, or imagines something and the thing seen or imagined by him. On the contrary, there is a generic difference between them. When I think of the Himalayas, neither I who think, nor my act of thinking, resembles a Himalayan peak. The peak is a mountain, occupying an enormous space, while my thinking has nothing of a mountain about it, nor does it occupy even the smallest space. But the same thing happens if, instead of thinking of the Himalayas, I think of the number 18. In my consciousness, my being, my spirit, my subjective self, I do not find anything which might be an 18. As a crowning touch, we can say that the act in which I think of 18 units is itself alone and unique. You tell me if there is likeness between them. These are clearly heterogeneous entities. And yet the fundamental task of history, if it wishes to be in all seriousness a science, must be to show how this philosophy, or that political system, could only have been discovered, developed, and, in short, lived by a particular type of man who lived at a particular date. Why, among the many possible types of philosophy, was it only criticism which came to lodge, to make itself actual in the soul of Kant? Is it not clear that in order to explain it, to comprehend it, we must build a double table of correspondence wherein each type of objective idea will be counterbalanced by the related subjective state, the type of man capable of thinking it? But do not fall back into the triviality which has blocked the march of thought for the past 80 years. Do not interpret what has been said as if it implied a basic relativism, so that each truth would be true only for a certain person. The fact that a truth, if thus it is, has value for everybody, and the fact that only one or two people, or only in a single period, will come to know it and to lend it their support, these are two completely different things. For the very reason that they are different, one must put them together, bring them into harmony, overcome the scandalous situation of thought in which the absolute value of the truth seemed incompatible with the change in opinions which human history shows in such abundance. We must recognize variations in thinking not as changes in yesterday's truth, which convert it into today's error, but as changes in man's orientation, which lead him to see other truths that are different from those of yesterday. It is not truths that change, but man who changes, and who, because he changes, goes on scanning the series of truths, goes on choosing from that trans-mundane sphere to which we earlier alluded the ones which are right for him, and blinding himself to all the rest. Note that this is a history's basic and fundamental a priori. Is it not the history of man? And what kind of entity is this called man, whose variations throughout time history aspires to investigate? It is not easy to define man. The margin of his differences is enormous. The bigger it is, and the broader the concept of man with which the historian begins his labor, the more profound and precise will be his work. Kant is a man, so is the pygmy of New Guinea, or the Australian Neanderthaloid. Nevertheless, between the extreme ends of human variation, there must be a minimum ingredient of common characteristics. The margin which we grant humanity, in order that it may be, humanity must have a limit. The ancient world and the medieval world each had their minimum definition of man. Strictly speaking, and to our shame let it be said, it has not been surpassed. Man is the rational animal. We agree with this. The difficulty is that it has become no small problem for us to know clearly what it is to be an animal and what it is to be rational. Therefore, we would rather say, for the uses of history, that man is every living being who thinks with meaning, and whose thinking we are therefore able to understand. The minimum that history assumes is that the subject of whom it speaks can be understood. Well then, a thing or being cannot be understood unless it possesses some degree of truth. An absolute error would not seem such to us because we would not even understand it. History's profound assumption, then, is the complete opposite of a basic relativism. When history goes to study primitive man, it assumes that his culture had meaning and truth, and that if it had these attributes, it continues to have them. What if, at first sight, so much that those creatures do and think seems so absurd to us? History is the second look, which manages to find the reason for what appears to be unreason. Therefore, history is not properly history, does not fulfill its inner mission, unless it achieves an understanding of man in his period, whatever that may be, including the most primitive. But it cannot understand this if man himself in that period leads a life that has no meaning, if what he thinks and does has no rational structure. In this manner, history is bound to justify all periods, and this is the opposite of what it was first threatening to be. On showing us the variability of human opinions, it seems to condemn us to relativism. But as it gives full meaning to each relative position that man takes, and reveals to us the eternal truth which every period has lived, it overcomes whatever there is in relativism that is incompatible with faith in man's extra-relative and, as it were, eternal destiny. For very concrete reasons, I hope that in our age the curiosity about the eternal and invariable, which is philosophy, and the curiosity about the inconstant and changing, which is history, may come together and embrace. For Descartes, man is a pure rational entity, incapable of variation. Hence history seems to him to concern the inhuman in man, and he attributes it to the sinful will which is continually making us cease to be rational entities and fall into infrahuman adventure. For him, as for the 18th century, history has no positive content, but represents the series of errors and equivocations which man has committed. On the other hand, the historical theory of the 19th century joined with positivism to cut themselves loose from every eternal value in order to salvage the relative value of each separate period. It is useless for us to try to do violence to our modern sensibilities, which resist any impulse to dispense with either dimension, the temporal or the eternal. To bring both of them together must be the great philosophic task of the present generation. For this, I have managed to initiate a method which the Germans, with their liking for elaborate labels, have baptized for me with the name perspectivism. From 1840 to 1900, it can be said that humanity went through one of those periods which are least favorable to philosophy. It was an anti-philosophic age. If philosophy could be abolished, there is no doubt that during those years it would have disappeared completely. However, as it is not possible to root out of the human mind its philosophic bent, what was done was to reduce it to a minimum. And the entire battle, which certainly will still be hard enough, in which we are presently engaged, consists in starting anew toward a philosophy which shall be full and complete, toward a maximum of philosophy. How was that reduction of philosophy, that shrinking of the body of philosophy, brought about? The series of causes which explain so curious a thing will occupy us in the next chapter.